have a dream. One day, this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident.
Hey guys, it's Eric here, and in this video we're joined by Christopher Wells. Christopher Wells is an American-Canadian student currently studying classics at the University of British Columbia. He was born and raised in the Washington, D.C. area, and politics has always been in close proximity to his life. He's a free speech advocate and hopes to go on to law school to continue his work defending free speech. In this video, Christopher and I have a thought-provoking and interesting conversation about what is at the heart of cancel culture, what cancel culture actually looks like, how cancel culture might not serve the communities that it intends to, the importance of rational and meaningful dialogue when discussing critical social issues, and lots more. I really enjoyed having this conversation with Christopher, and his unique American perspective definitely broadened the way that I see cancel culture, and I hope you enjoy watching the video. Without further ado, here it is.
Hey guys, it's Eric here, and I am back with another video, and I'm so glad to say that in this video I'm joined by Christopher Wells.
Thanks so much for having me.
No problem at all, Christopher. Christopher is someone I met on Clubhouse. I've engaged in a lot of conversation with Christopher and a lot of other people about issues like cancel culture, like modern day activism, like wokeism. And I've definitely found Christopher to be one of the more refreshing voices on the app. And it's definitely been great to see a lot of the takes Christopher has adopted when it comes to a lot of the big issues that are related to things like cancel culture. So it's so great to have him in this video. But before we get into the video, I think, Christopher, you made a huge leap recently by being a part of a fantastic organization known as FAIR. I think it's the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, which, you know, the panel, it includes a lot of seminal intellectuals, the likes of Coleman Hughes, Camille Foster, activists like Darrell Davis, and you're involved with the organization. So before we actually get into cancel culture, do you want to talk a bit about FAIR and how you got involved with them?
Yeah, gladly. So it is the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. I'm the social media manager, and I'm doing the weekly newsletter. I may be doing more behind the scenes going forward. And I actually got involved with them through Clubhouse. It's a great networking app. I had a friend, Charlotte Brokeem, who does Let's Talk Sex with Barry Weiss on Clubhouse. And the current social media manager was leaving. She reached out to me, and one thing led to another. FAIR is a great organization. As you said, the board of advisors is just stacked with pro-human intellectual voices, center-right and center-left, which is what we really need. It's interesting to see because it actually still is a small organization with a huge power behind it with the board of advisors. So we've garnered more attention, perhaps faster than we expected. So we're really still getting things kicking. But the goal is to be a counterweight against intolerance from any side of the aisle. We are nonpartisan. We advocate for free speech, but more than anything, a pro-human approach to combating things like cancel culture, which I think we're going to get into in this conversation. I think there hasn't been a great coalition built from liberals and conservatives alike who are concerned about the illiberal forces in our society. And this is one way of picking up where the ACLU left off in terms of advocating for civil liberties in a nonpartisan sense.
Thank you so much for the rundown there, Christopher. And I'm actually going to have a link to FAIR's website. So if anyone here in Ireland wants to learn more about the organization, you can by tapping the link in my description. So I want to get into cancel culture because you said there you're a free speech advocate. You operate on college campuses. And in America, it seems from an outsider's perspective, like cancel culture is a problem that a lot of young people are reckoning with. It's an issue that has greatly been politicized, and a lot of people are having political and apolitical conversations about it. But I want to ask you, Christopher, how would you define cancel culture? Because it seems like when I engage in discussions with a lot of people about it, they tend to point out the fact that cancellation has existed for millennia. We've seen a form of cancellation manifest in the Inquisition. Here in Ireland, for a while, the church was very much married to the state. So anyone who took a position that was anti-Catholic church was cancelled in a sense. So what makes this form of cancellation different and worthy of the amount of attention that it's getting in public discourse at the moment?
Yeah, certainly. I'm glad you asked that question, because it's generally one I've been unprepared for and I've had to dwell a lot on, because in my realm, I'm dealing with looking at the latest cancellations, generally the most atrocious, on a day-to-day basis. So to me, it's like, how do you not know what it is? And sometimes it's a bad faith question, but yes. And that's another thing I hear quite a bit, is that it's a millennia long problem, or to some people, not a problem. What's different now is the speed and vigor with which it happens. I think when you reference the church, there used to be at least some amount of a governing or religious body that would lead cancellations. Now it can really be anyone with the power of social media. So I think what's different is the speed with which it can happen, and the fact that it happens less or more to non-public figures than people think. A lot of people will go, well, look, nothing really too awful happened to J.K. Rowling or whoever it be. But it's the cancellations you don't hear about that are the most upsetting. I was canceled myself my first year at university, and I got no press. So it's the wildfire spread. Obviously, there have been extrajudicial cancellations throughout the ages, primarily the Salem witch trials. There was no governing body, that was just townspeople. But the main thing that I hear is, well, this has happened for millennia, so why should we be concerned now? And the answer is, it wasn't good when it happened back then, and it's not good now either.
Yep, that's a fantastic point, Christopher, and it was very insightful. Before getting to the next question, and I want to ask you about what is at the core of cancel culture. Before getting to there, though, I want to firstly ask you, what does cancellation look like? Because it seems like in America, from looking at political conversations about cancel culture and universities, that a lot of kind of right-wingers, traditional right-wingers, get on and talk about how the college campuses are being attacked, that professors are being cancelled. And a lot of it, from an outsider's perspective, kind of looks like hyperbole. We don't really know here what's going on the ground. And it looks like people who are so attached to their political dogmas are just engaging in anything that will allow them to get the upper hand over the other side in the culture war, in the cancel culture conversation. And I think it takes away from the essence of cancel culture. So is it all hyperbole, or what's actually happening? Is cancel culture when there's a pylon on Twitter, or is it when someone is fired? What does it look like to be canceled?
That's a good question. And I do think it varies. I think on a university campus, it's not as much reputation destruction to be worried about as, for many people it is. For me, that wasn't much of an issue, because I've always been a provocateur to some extent. But in the workplace, I think, is the scary place, because my career is not up in the air. I don't have a career. I don't face anything except for being marked down in class or having some angry students to deal with. But if you're 40 and working at a corporation, you can lose your livelihood. And it happens all the time. There was a UPS truck driver. Have you heard about this anecdote? Yeah, doing this to signal for someone to pass him, and apparently that's a white supremacist symbol, and they lost their livelihood. So on college campus, it's hard to, I think the idea that it's very widespread is true. However, the people who enact it are actually a minority. It's more the bystanders. So I don't have an accurate representation of what my peers actually believe, but I know plenty of people who will not go out of their way to ruin your reputation. However, they do agree enough with the dogma that they'll stand by. And what I really notice is the sensitivity in any given classroom, even on Zoom, is everyone is afraid to say the wrong thing. Everyone is afraid to misgender someone or whatever it be. So it's more the fear element than the actual reputation destruction that happens on university campuses. There's really a gaslighting element, because you have to take a step back and see it for what it is before you realize. For many people, that's just the objective plane that they're functioning on. And it's kind of the orthodoxy of social justice is the underlying objective grounds for students here. So it's kind of like, if you go back to the 1900s, there were people who were not vehemently religious, but they wouldn't dare say there's not a God. It's much the same. It's a belief structure that the professors or whoever it be are the priests, and the students are just kind of going to church.
Yeah, that's a fantastic way to conceptualize it. And I really appreciated what you said about fear, and I think that factor is excluded a lot in conversations about cancel culture. And some of my friends here in Ireland, I joke and jest with them about the fact that they tell me that they type tweets sometimes to kind of comment on social issues, and they don't tweet it at the end. They kind of cancel everything out, and they'd be like, nope, I'll be canceled for that, so I'm not going to spare my voice to this issue. So I think that fear is an important factor, and a culture that promotes fear instead of incentivizes participation when it comes to difficult dialogue, I think is one that is somewhat regressive. And I think it's important for us to get to the core, which is what my next question will be centered on. What do you think is at the core of cancel culture? I think as a phenomenon, it's contrary to growth and human evolution. It denies the fact that we can evolve into being better beings, ideologically, spiritually, if you want to look at it in a metaphysical way, intellectually as well. When 3 years ago, Christopher, like if someone put up stuff I put up there on social media, you could possibly cancel me. But now I like to think that I'm a different person to the one I was then. But if I wasn't allowed to evolve into the phase I'm in right now, I wouldn't be a better person. And I think we need to encourage evolution in all its forms rather than discourage it and criticize it and demonize it. Before I ask you what's at the core of cancel culture, I think it's worth mentioning Daryl Davis, who's part of FAIR, the organization you're part of. I think he's dedicated his activism to converting 200 members of the KKK out of the KKK, convincing them out of their ways of thinking as a Black American. When it comes to racism, you can't get more extreme than the KKK. If anyone's worthy of cancellation, if cancellation is justifiable, it is them. Yet this Black American took it upon himself to convert KKK members. MLK is another great example. I like to coin the term Mlk Paradox. When he operated as an activist, he was speaking about the humanity that both he and the racists at a time of rampant racism in America shared, and how it was they who were in the wrong, but that they weren't worthy of demonization because they, like him, was a human being. And he devoted his activism to converting them. Now, figures that are nowhere near as extreme as the KKK that Daryl Davis has worked with, the white supremacists that MLK appealed to, are being canceled. So what is at the core of this phenomenon? Is it an unwillingness to engage in difficult dialogue? What is it?
Well, I think there's a couple things. And before I get into that, this is something Hitchens has spoken about. This is what I was talking about with canceling to avoid cancellation, is people look at an authoritarian society like Nazi Germany with very clear defined rules. And as long as you follow the rules, you may survive. But the truth is the rules should always be shifting. So you're always afraid and you never know if you're going to step out of line. That's something that Solzhenitsyn writes about beautifully in the first volume of the Gulag Archipelago. But going to your question, what's causing it? Well, first, in particularly in Europe, but now really in America and Canada, there's we've been running on post-Christian fumes for so long. Even people who go to church aren't Bible literalists unless they're in the Bible Belt. The rate at which atheism has come about in the States it has been unfounded. So there's a need for a belief system that's lacking in many youths. And this isn't an advocacy to go back to Christianity. I'm personally agnostic. I'm neither atheist or a believer myself, but it shows that lacking a belief system and a greater community around that, something's going to fill that void. And secondly is, particularly with young people who oftentimes lead cancellations, is there's a real pain in being Gen Z. And I don't mean that in the sense that there's this paradox of victimhood where we want to play identity politics and be victims for being whatever color or whatever sexuality or whatever gender or whatever it be, but that's a cover for other pain, and the pain is lack of social connection, addiction issues, primarily pornography with young men, substance addiction, all of these things. So I think identity politics is really a cover for more internal pain that is the intrinsic human pain that every human is capable of feeling that we can no longer discuss.
That's very interesting what you said there, and I guess the religiosity point was quite interesting as well. How we nearly have this impulse to cling on to an ideology that gives us comfort, that gives us a home, and how cancel culture and the surrounding wider culture that kind of encapsulates it is something that people are clinging on to in a religious way. I guess getting on to the next question, I think this is an important question that I think people like you are fantastic activists and others definitely need to reckon with when trying to promote the right message that FAIR as an organization is trying to promote. It seems that a lot of bona fide good faith actors are getting caught up in the hype. People who genuinely want to bring about progressive social change in society, especially for groups that may be deemed to be marginalized, are getting caught up in cancel culture. They believe in canceling individuals. It might be what secures a better society. So in America, do you feel, this is what I perceive here in Ireland, a lot of good faith actors advocating for cancel culture because they think it's what's best. In America, do you think this is true? Are there a lot of good faith actors getting caught up in the hype? And what do you think can be done to detach them from the phenomenon?
That's a great question. The thing about cancel culture, not the act of cancellation, but just this ideology, wokeism or liberalism, whatever you want to call it, is it weaponizes empathy. Some of the most empathetic people I know are on board with this. And the thing is, they don't dive into the theory. They're not politically engaged. Again, these are the people I'm speaking about on campus who are generally apolitical, lacking a belief system, need something to believe, very empathetic. They don't know what it looks like. But they're told, if you don't do XYZ or agree with XYZ, you are a terrible person. So of course they'll go along with it. So I think a lot of it's more weaponized empathy than cynical dogma. That said, those are the bystanders. In my experience, the people who will go out of their way to ruin your life are full of resent, full of anger, full of pain, and oftentimes have been marginalized. So I really think there's a power element to it. And when I look back on when I was a social justice advocate, I was a lost 16-year-old who needed to feel righteous, whose identity had totally shifted in the past few years and was just lost in the fray. I think that's the majority of people. So I think the good faith actors are those on the periphery. So again, if you look at it like a church, your professors who are really pushing the dogma are the priests, and then the students who will partake in cancellation are your missionaries, and then you just have the regular churchgoers who haven't necessarily read the scripture but need a belief system and only see the periphery. Because what these mainstream media outlets will do is they'll downplay it and call it things like a reckoning, but they won't directly endorse it, but they'll make it seem like there's not really an issue with cancel culture. So it's more the people on the periphery I'm concerned about.
Yeah, those are great, very articulate points that you made there, Christopher. And there's lots that you kind of touch on there that I'd like to acknowledge before moving on to the next question. You kind of spoke about how a lot of the politicians kind of bow to cancel culture, maybe for fear of electoral punishment if that did not happen, or if they didn't do that. And I think it's quite interesting that occurs, because according to a lot of the polls that I've seen conducted in the USA, when it comes to a lot of the issues that this kind of phenomenon, this ideology, as you put it, would advocate for, a lot of people on the ground who this culture is supposedly catering towards are against it. I think in our first Clubhouse chat, I talked about a proposition that was forwarded in California and was voted upon I think it was in Congress, and it was advocating for race-based hiring procedures, being involved in how people were appointed into particular educational and professional positions. It was a proposition that advocated for this. And when polled, the majority of the Black community in California repudiated it. So did the majority of the Latino community and the majority of the white community and wider California. Yet, Nike, Facebook, I don't believe it was Nike actually, Facebook, many corporations in California, and a lot of the politicians, left and right, supported it because they thought it was what this culture would mandate, and therefore was good for the minorities and the people in particular communities that it supposedly or ostensibly caters towards. So it seems like it's kind of out of touch with a lot of people on the ground. The fact also that I think you and I insinuated that a lot of friends that we have, well, I think I did earlier, would want to put out particular views and points out in good faith about social progress, let's say on Twitter, but would be scared to, because they know as soon as they do, a kind of mob might attack them, kind of claiming that they're doing what they shouldn't be doing in terms of social progress in that context also. So it seems like the theory is somewhat out of touch with ordinary people to some extent. So yes, this is an observation that I've made recently. Getting on to the next question, though,
real quick, if I may reply to that briefly. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I think there's a lot to get at there, in that preposition in California. This is where the doublespeak comes in, because when people campaign for these things, they'll use terms like equity, so on and so forth. But it was a referendum, so fortunately, the people of California got to vote on it. And when it came to reading the law and signing yes or no, it was quite apparent that equity was a glossy term, and what we mean is discrimination based on race. So yeah, that's just what I wanted to point out, is that there's so much doublespeak. And in terms of advocating for people on the ground, 81% of Black Americans don't want to defund the police. And what it comes down to is living in different realities due to technology. We're at a point where objective truth is fractured across Western society, but that's a great danger. At the same time, most people who are concerned about this either A, don't want to speak up, or B, don't have a network of like-minded people. Anyway, my apologies for interrupting the flow.
One of the most scary things I think that is embedded in cancel culture, or at least its implications, is the fact that, again, it does not you kind of adopt that idea of redemption that has been advocated for the best activists of the 20th century, like Gandhi, like Mlk, like Nelson Mandela. Instead, it rejects that and kind of opts for methods of pushing people away. And I think in pushing people away, this culture forgets, or at least isn't aware of where these people are being pushed to. And I think cancel culture has the potential to further radicalize people. If one is in a cesspot of negative views and ideologies, which are just, one could probably characterize them as objectively bad and regressive. Counseling the person instead of holistically engaging with them to see what you can do to approach and reform them is a method that could further radicalize them. And as I kind of touched on earlier, keep them in the faith that they're in, which isn't necessarily best for them. And I think a cruel irony in all of this is that, prison reform is something that I would definitely be passionate about. And in conversations about that, a lot of people would talk about reforming individuals and not just throwing them in prisons and allowing them to rot. Yet with cancel culture, a lot of those who may advocate for prison reform would opt for the opposite method. Wouldn't be for reforming people. Instead, would want to allow people to rot in their vicarious jail with the ideology that got them there in the first place. So, do you think cancel culture has the potential to further radicalize people? And do you think the approach being taken at the moment to engage with those who might have bad views, objectively bad views, is good or progressive in any way?
Wow. Yes. Firm yes. But the point I really want to make is many of the people, we're at a point where society has really pushed away anyone with objectively bad views. But in terms of radicalization, certainly. During 2020, it was before I had made any network. And I was still kind of in the rock bottom of my social isolation. Girlfriend had just broken up with me, and I was toying with the idea of voting for Trump because I was so sick. And if you knew me 2 years ago, Chris Wells toying with the idea of voting for Trump. But then there are people who will be pushed much further. And I don't know if personally I have rethought my politics or if the ground underneath me has shifted. I think it's a bit of both. Now I think of myself as center right. I still wince at the idea of being conservative. But yeah, I mean, you look at Charlottesville with 20-year-old white young men legitimately endorsing white supremacy. Why are they so angry? And this was when cancel culture was really first getting kicking. And I mean, if I can really understand it in that, because I grew up so progressive before wokeism was a thing, but the seeds had been laid. I grew up really wanting to reject being a white straight man. I felt that there was no identity for me, being raised in such a progressive bubble. And I was the president of Young Democrats and interned at the ACLU. And I remember just thinking, will there be a spot for me here in a year? So if you have someone who doesn't have as benevolent of a family or a life situation or friends and support systems and goes to university and they're just rotting online, hearing about how evil white straight men are, something that both Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein have warned about is the boogeyman alt-right that people are worried about now. They will awaken the real alt-right if things go much further. And that's not a threat, it's an observation. And I don't see it becoming enough of a threat where there's a legitimate white supremacist threat in the United States because so many people have been pushed that way. But I do see the danger becomes playing identity politics back. Because right now we know how ugly left-wing identity politics are. We haven't seen right-wing identity politics since World War II, really. And that is a truly ugly game to play.
Wow, that's definitely one way to put it. I think the next question I'm going to ask is quite important, but just to stay on this one, to ponder on this one for a second, and maybe the challenge, because I think Jordan Peterson is notorious for talking about how, right-wing identity politics, or at least the quasi-right-wing identity politics, which is what we saw manifest in Charlottesville, was a reaction to the vicious, more malignant left-wing identity politics. But a lot of people that I spoke to who are on the left say that left-wing identity politics actually is a reaction to right-wing identity politics. So what would you say to this, that, maybe underlying racism or phobias that are within society is what breeded kind of fostered or created a breeding ground for this left-wing identity politics, which is so condemned by the likes of Jordan Peterson, to conceive itself in the first place?
Certainly. I mean, that's why I say the many of the qualms they have are, at their core, are perfectly legitimate. It's the prescriptions, but we've gotten to a point where now the qualms themselves are absolutely ridiculous. Like Vox publishing an article saying chess is systemically racist because white moves first. That's not a legitimate qualm with society. But it depends, because racism in the United States in particular was never a left-right thing for its endurance up until LBJ. It was just a thing. It wasn't caused by right-wing identity politics. It was caused by the racism of human nature. I don't know, in terms of Charlottesville, if it were to happen now, I think you could certainly say it's a reaction to left-wing identity politics. But perhaps at that point, those people had been festering for a while, because white supremacy is legitimate white supremacy. KKK white supremacy has never been fully stamped out in the United States, but I think we're about as close to it as we can ever wish to legitimately stamping it out. The back and forth is, I think it's greater than a left-right binary, and it comes down to human nature.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question, which I think is a very significant one in the conversation about cancel culture, because a lot of reasonable, rational people I speak to about cancel culture who want to justify it understandably talk about the need for holding people to account for their wrongs. They talk about how, no one should be able to get away with doing something that is so egregious or saying something that is so hurtful, objectively speaking, because something that is hurtful, of course, can be interpreted in a subjective way. But let's just assume that what they said was just incredibly wrong. Let's say a Holocaust denier, for example. All of my friends I speak to who justify these means of cancellation would say they have to be held to account for it. And a lot of people might be using the cancel culture complaint to prevent people from holding others to account. So it seems to be a blurred, there seems to be a blurred, slashed, fine line between holding people to account and cancellation, depending on who you are. So what do you think distinguishes both?
Wow. Well, I've tried to dwell on this. The question really comes down to, who are you accountable to? I don't like that word is used. To my knowledge, it was actually used quite a bit during the Cultural Revolution in Mao's China. The question, if you're a private citizen, recently there was a private citizen who is an EMT who donated something like $10 to Kyle Rittenhouse in his legal defense fund. And the media has come from, who is he accountable to? He's an EMT who serves the county or the community. Who is he accountable to? When it comes to Harvey Weinstein, very different people. When it comes to Harvey Weinstein, even if cancel culture weren't happening at the time, everyone would have held him accountable. But I think you're asking in terms of action, and the fine line really comes down to private citizen and public figure. I don't think private citizens, unless they commit an abhorrent crime, are accountable to anyone but their peers and family. Why on earth are they accountable to the general public? I've been told many times by my peers here at UBC that I need to be held accountable. And these aren't my close peers. These are just people who know me for who I am. Why am I accountable to you? Am I disrupting the purity of the campus? So the question, I think, is less where the line is and why is anyone accountable to any other one individual unless they've committed a violent crime or legitimately incited hatred.
Okay, I'm going to rephrase the question just to have you comment on it. Okay, so there are social implications with what is done and what is said. And being a free speech advocate, I'm sure many have spoke to you about those who literally espouse hateful views. So cancel culture, on the one hand, is something that we're both kind of challenging and criticizing in this video, the idea of it. But what about social implications to what one says? Back to the idea of one being a Holocaust denier. If somebody did deny the Holocaust and people came at that person aggressively for doing so because of the emotions that that person might have aroused in the public, how do you distinguish that, the social implications of what someone does, and cancel culture itself?
Well, it's hard to say. I think even prior to social media, if you were a neo-Nazi and proud of it, there would have been social implications. And I think that's the question society has been grappling with for as long as it's been around, is where are the new moral lines? Just decades ago, you would have faced severe social consequences for being homosexual. And now, if you speak against homosexuality, you face severe consequences. So, I think it goes back to the qualms being legitimate and the prescription being wrong. I'm sorry I don't have a more concise answer for this question. It's because I think it's the question that we're all grappling with. I think even then, when it comes to cancellation and online mobs, and we speak about radicalization, there's no good faith. There's no good faith presumed. You can make cases like Stalin was worse than Hitler in a terribly articulated manner and face social ramifications for that. Or that Mao was worse than Hitler. If you play by the numbers, they both were. And so what I'm saying is it's really a loss of good faith. And the reason that's so dangerous is then people are afraid to inquire into questions that should be asked, like, was Stalin worse than Hitler? Or whatever it be. Where does systemic racism exist? I'm getting so vague here with you now. I'm a little talked out.
No, your answers are fantastic, and I do apologize for putting such an enormous question to you in magnitude. That question is pretty big, and I'm sure some people who have seriously thought about it and do so for a living, the intellectuals grapple with that question rigorously, frequently. So I shouldn't have necessarily posed it to you in that manner. And it's fair to say that you did a fantastic job in answering it. So thanks so much for proffering that answer. And that's a great way to see it. Okay, I'm going to end this video on a perspective note and look to the future. Okay, in asking you this, right? So we've acknowledged that public discourse is important, talking about the big issues, the challenging issues, in a way that encourages dialogue rather than disincentivizes it is good. We both kind of condemn cancel culture as well. Fair enough. But how do we, in Christopher's world, let's say you are the grand emperor of the entire world, and you have you're omnipotent, you can persuade us into anything at all. If you are to persuade us into a model of public discourse, which did not embrace cancel culture, but completely repudiated all the phobias and types of discrimination that exist, what would be the tenets of such a model of public discourse? What would Christopher promulgate amongst his subordinates?
Oh my goodness. You're making me one of Plato's philosopher kings here. That's the tenets would be the tenets we had prior to the digital age. I think that's our mitigating factor. I'm a free speech absolutist. I really don't care if people are offended in terms of persuasion, right? There's also in terms of public discourse, there's going to be a difference in addressing a crowd, which oftentimes is more inflammatory than addressing an individual. It's the classical liberal humanist view that there's intrinsic feelings in nature between humans, and obviously you want to err on the side of respect and common shared humanity, but you do not want to let sympathy overwhelm intellectual discourse. That said, the other tenets would be greatly against hyperbole and incitement, which is, you know, where free speech often runs awry. I think the big solution, let's say, that we're dealing with this little experiment in the technological age of online discourse would be for social media companies to open their algorithms to scrutiny. We know that they put us into echo chambers purposely, and you just have to think about what would happen if we were made to see the opposing side's posts and on a similar basis. I actually have a rule with myself that I don't unfollow anyone on Twitter that I disagree with to avoid putting myself into such an echo chamber. Again, not a very concise answer, but I think the core tenets go back to John Stuart Mill on liberty and the First Amendment that we already have in the United States. That's why I'm fighting so hard to defend it, is the core tenets have been there for hundreds of years at this point in time. And it's the First Amendment for a reason. And when it comes to all other issues, I hate to be a one issue voter, but I don't care about healthcare or any of these other things if it's a society without free speech, which is perhaps a very narrow-minded and obnoxious thing to say, but this is my hill to die on.
Fantastic. Well, you know, it's fair to say you'd be a pretty effective emperor, to say the least. But no, thanks so much, Christopher, and thanks so much for joining me in this video. It's definitely very insightful. I certainly learned a lot from speaking with you, and it's always fantastic to see people, young people in particular, passionate about a cause that they believe will advance society. So thanks so much for hopping on this video and for partaking. Thanks so much.
Eric, thank you for having me. As Greg has noted a multitude of times on Clubhouse now, can listen to your accent all day. So it was a pleasure to sit down and chat with you. And honestly, I wish I was a little less scatterbrained this morning. It's been a crazy week, but I wish I could have answered a few of those questions more concisely. But they're good questions, right? Because you and I are essentially on the same side of this cancel culture controversy, and you're asking me the difficult questions, which is always good to foster some intellectual growth.
There you go. Thanks so much, Christopher, and hopefully we'll have you back on in the future.
Most definitely.